This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air on our Facebook, Twitch, and YouTube channels with Diana Stelin for the first time. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
I want to let people know we are a featured podcast on Newsly. You can see that icon up there says listen on Newsly. If you use coupon code GHOST, you get 1 month free premium subscription so you can stop scrolling and start listening. We will be on Newsly later tonight. And again, we're featured on that platform. So again, this is episode 877 of the Fam Electric Ghost podcast. And we're happy gotten that far. We've been on the air since 2016. And what we're going to focus on tonight for the topic is how do you battle burnout? Start with like what your strategies for that are.
I'm a visual artist, and I've discovered pretty early in my life that having access to that creative outlet is huge because what it does is it employs the other side of your brain that you might not be typically used to using, right, on the everyday, on the day to day. And because you are accessing something that is not employed a lot, it actually creates that balance that the other side of the brain needs a bit of a break and a bit of a reprieve from being tapped into all the time. And because of that balance, the exhaustion and overwhelm feels a lot less difficult to deal with. And I've noticed that by initially when I was a teenager and I first accessed creativity, and then as a young adult, and then through leading hundreds and hundreds of workshops for companies like Google and Deloitte, and just had a workshop earlier today for another digital marketing firm, which went incredibly well. And what's always amazing to me is watching people literally physically change in front of my eyes. They would come in, whether it's virtually or in person. Today was actually my very first in-person workshop since COVID, which was very exciting. They would come in and there's obviously some stress and tension because they know that they're going to be doing something that's way out of their comfort zone. But about 20 minutes into the workshops, I can see a lot more color in their faces. They're a lot more talkative with their peers. And it's almost like you can see the stress melting away. It's beautiful to watch. And they look like little kids whose fingers are twitching in anticipation of new techniques they're going to learn.
That's interesting because, I'm a podcaster, but I have a couple other day jobs. I'm an IT system analyst, and I'm a music producer, keyboardist, synth sound designer. And so I try to take a lot of the artistic things I do and kind of embed them in what I do in my job. Because as a software designer, we're very creative, but it's for business, right?
Right.
But when I'm a musician, I'm also creative, but it's art. And I found that when I access the kind of creativity of my kind of like, I don't know, stream of consciousness style of writing, that I find that kind of open-minded thinking really helps my day-to-day job. That that habit of music, being a piano player, being a synth player, I look forward to that time that I rehearse and do work and even do this podcast, where that creative part of myself actually makes me more satisfied as a person.
Yeah. And what's really fascinating, especially post-COVID, I definitely see a huge difference in the way things are taught at schools these days because for so many years, kids were taught to pass, SAT exams, and all the arts curriculum has been taken out. And I think because of that, we're seeing the consequences because all of these kids post-pandemic who've gone through a really, really traumatic couple of years don't really have the means to process their emotions, to process trauma. And that's what music and dance and visual art are so great at doing, because a lot of these emotions cannot be put, you can access them, you can access your intuition, you can have that really cathartic experience of expressing yourself through the creative arts that you don't really have a chance to do anywhere else. And what's really fascinating is that now that a lot more focus is put onto mental health, kids who have been diagnosed with anxiety, and my daughter is one of them, they were officially prescribed art therapy. And I think it's such a positive change, and I look forward to seeing more of that being in the mainstream.
Because I started this podcast and we mostly talked to singer-songwriters, and one thing I noted in the 300 interviews I've had with singer-songwriters around the world is they consider what they do therapeutic.
Yeah.
That most of the musicians I talked to said they would still do it if they made money or not, but it's part of their kind of mental health. That being an artist, being a writer, whether or not anybody ever hears what they're doing or sees what they're doing, that process of the creative process actually is a way to kind of deal with what's going on in your head. And I think when you're a creative, you're able to take those things that happen inside and out, like microcosm, macrocosm, and apply your artistic filter, and you kind of take the muse and you take the universe, and you know, kind of it all jumbles together, and you just create something. And people who aren't creative don't really understand how we do it. But I think when you start to teach people art therapy, you can kind of, I believe every human being is capable of doing that. Just maybe they weren't that they could. And I think there's always all kinds of possibilities. Do you find that, you know, there are people who think they can't do that, and then they find when they get into art therapy that they have more capability than they believe they did?
Yeah, it's definitely a known fact that everyone has that innate creativity, though back in elementary school and when they were little kids, they could access that readily. But the older someone gets, the more self-conscious they become. So unless they've been educated to develop that side of themselves, they lose sense of their creative self. What's really fascinating, especially in people who are not thinking of themselves as creative. And of course, the very first thing that people say to me in these corporate workshops when they come in is, I don't know why I signed up for this. I don't have a creative bone in my body. This is just going to be terrible. And the very first thing I say to them is, imagine that you're 4 years old again and you just learned how to make basic shapes. And that's really all you need to get started. And even in just that one phrase gets them into a completely different and much more open state of mind. And what I love about all the neurological research that's been taking place on creativity and getting into flow, and we know that flow is not only accessible to us creative people, it's in the sports world, it's in a lot of different professions, is that being exposed to, on one hand, being exposed to art, even for 20 minutes a day, decreases our cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone, by crazy amounts. And then what it also does
Yeah, the
is it,
fight or flight
yeah,
hormone.
exactly. And what it also does, it builds our neuroplasticity, our brain's neuroplasticity, which is our brain's recovery system and learning system. So it really makes us into much more balanced and holistic individuals when we're able to tap into that. And another thing that I found interesting, especially after going, through the pandemic, and I know we're all sick about talking about COVID these days, but that creativity is actually at its highest after periods of intense stress. Isaac Newton created his
Mhm.
theories
I
right
I can
after
attest to that.
the bubonic plague. Yeah. William Shakespeare wrote King Lear among his very other really important plays right after the outbreaks of the plague. So right now is that time when we're most vulnerable and most able to access creativity. So it's just a matter of learning to tap into it.
Yeah, because I was talking to a lot of artists, and a lot of them were upset because, musicians especially, we can't make money unless we tour, but we found other way because the thing that I found artists under COVID, what they did is they say, "I'm gonna learn that other instrument that I never took time to do," right? Or, "I'm gonna work on that big idea that because I was touring, I couldn't do it." And, I'm sitting in my home studio with all my keyboards and stuff, and a lot of us have bedroom studios. That we put our tools so close to us so that we can create all the time. And when we a lot of artists got, they're in their bedroom studios now because they kind of realized that they had to keep on working and they couldn't. And what people found is that they just opened up their minds and their hearts and their souls to, yeah, time for a creative is actually not something where we actually don't have a lot sometimes. Having that during the whole COVID period gave artists a lot of time to be creative. And creative people, we kinda are in this zone when we're in that space where we're kinda away from other people, where we're doing something, and we find that usable, and we had a lot of it, and so I wonder, like, how you get people who are so busy to find the space to be creative, because I like people are like in the corporate world when I'm in that. Well, you're like, oh, I'm maxed out. I can't do it because I'm stressed out. I'm maxed out. I'm to the limit. So how do you get them to kind of realize they should take this time because it actually is going to help them, like what you had said before.
Yeah, that honestly is the toughest thing because me, right, from the bottom of my heart, I know that it will help them. I know that it will relax them first and foremost and get them out of that state of overwhelm and get them to be a lot more productive in the long term, a lot more innovative in the long term. But yes, when you're feeling like everything is pulling at you at the same time, this is the very last thing you want to do. Why would I be doing some sort of a music or art class when I don't have time to brush my teeth, right? And I heard this amazing saying. I don't remember who said it, but it had to do with meditation. But I think it's really the same thing when it comes to creative arts. Is if you have 10 minutes, then meditate for 10 minutes. Um, but if you don't have more than 10 minutes, you should meditate for an hour, which essentially means that the more you think that you cannot manage your time, the more it means that you really need to be pushing yourself to do those things that will teach you, what the true purpose is, what's important, get you to the core of of who you were as a little kid, and what you wanted to do and what you were willing to experiment with. And like I mentioned, today was my first in-person workshop, and I think and I did a TED Talk last year. It was in March of 2022, and I really thought that right after the TED Talk, and that was in person, which was lovely. But I really thought that right after the TED Talk, I'm gonna have people knocking on my door nonstop because it was very well
Mhm.
received, and it's such pivotal and key information to get us out of this constant anxiety and stress, right? And it was just crickets because because I think people are so overwhelmed and not and they're trying to catch up on so much that they feel that they've missed over the last couple of years. And the balance
Mhm.
between life and work, I feel, has gotten even worse because now we are doing work at home
Yeah.
and we don't have that separation, and work runs into dinner time and then it runs into bedtime, um and I see that everywhere. So I have to say it's really the toughest thing to get people once they get into this immersive experience of doing something with their hands, of
Mhm.
creating. They get it, but selling this whole idea and how key and impactful it can
It's
be
always hard.
is tough. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, in our industry, like I'm And there's kind of a whole thing where guys who are programmers or software designers, they think it's like the holy grail to sit there for 12 hours in your chair, just be focused, right? And I've pointed out, being a manager and being a senior, that that's totally false, because there's like the diminished returns. What happens is you get so blindsided and you're so narrowly focused that you actually lose sight of the. And I tell people, I'd rather have you go take a walk, get out, go take a walk, come back, even take a day, come back, because I've seen people with their designs, it's like they just didn't see everything. They missed it because they were so narrow. And you really need to step away. And the same thing with music. If I'm producing people, I'm saying, don't sit in the studio for 6 hours. You walk out, you walk back in. You have to kind of give space to actually figure out what you just, and go back and look at it. And then you take another pass at it. And people who just sit there just trying to make it perfect, you end up not making it perfect at all.
I think we've been conditioned, right, over the years with time cards and to really put the time in, right? But people don't realize that putting the time in doesn't necessarily mean being productive. And my husband, who's also a programmer, he says he gets his best ideas in the shower, because that's the one time when he is away from his computer, just completely open to whatever comes, and some of his best solutions came to him that way. So yes, I definitely 100% agree with what you're saying. Take a walk, do something totally out of the ordinary, use the other side of your brain, and that immediately resets you.
Yeah, being a piano player, I'm telling you, like, when I stop my day job and I go sit at my Yamaha or my Roland or my Moog and play, I would tell you, like, the next day I go to work, my head is like been like revitalized, and I actually have the same kind of effect as if I took a walk in the woods. That playing that piano, about the hand uh eye coordination and the capability of, it's just like being an athlete. There's a certain level of dexterity on a piano, and using both your left and right hand, and your left and right brain, because you have to like think of two different things at the same time, the bass and the treble clef. It actually clears your head where you can't start thinking about work when you're playing a piano. If you're act playing, you think about what you were doing at work. It forces you to get into the music, kind of like if you're meditating, you meditate, and you start to clear the cobwebs.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I loved a comment that I got today. This one gentleman said that he felt like he could just turn off his head, and because this was such a new, undiscovered exercise, and he really needed to put all of his attention into understanding what is needed from him, that he couldn't focus on anything else. And I think it is so important to be able to just really go deep into something that is not your day-to-day job. And by doing that, you become a lot more able to be productive for other things. It's amazing how that works. And I really wish that musicians and artists were given a chance to show that to the rest of the world.
That I've been, with this podcast for like 878 episodes. That's what I've been trying to show, is the synergy between art and music specifically. Said, "Oh, you're a music podcaster. How can you talk to other people?" Because that's what I was in 2016. And then I went and I pointed out, like, the Beatles were probably one of the biggest life coaches for a lot of creative people all over the world, right? The idea out there. when they did Sergeant Pepper's and Abbey Road. They got people into music and art and the film. They were like life coaches and mentors to tons of people. So, and when I try to engage with the idea of music and creativity and art and poetry and writing things to your life, right? And so that you can't, the idea that you can separate art and you say, well, you need it. And just take away, like you were saying at the beginning, you just have an SAT, have no art, no music, because you need to engage those both sides of your brain, that a creativity actually expand. It's very that you once you go into that creative state of mind, you to many, many things, and the walls that you think are there are not as defined as you might think.
What's really fascinating to me too is the fact that, well, things are different around, and I don't know. Well, first of all, I wanted to say congrats because almost 900 episodes. That's such a feat. It's quite incredible. Just to wrap my head around how many varied people you've been able to tap into and spread the message, and I'm so happy to be a part of this. And I actually, when I was holding my workshop this morning, the woman that is in charge of the space is a musician, and I was sharing some of my personal stories of how I tapped into creativity during my most difficult moments in life, and how transformational it has been for me. And she came up to me at the end and she said, I never thought that visual artists are really the same thing as musicians, because I'm a musician and that's what I just always knew and thought of, but I didn't make the connection that creativity is all in the same, regardless of what specific area you're targeting. And the other thing that was really fascinating to me, I was chatting with someone from New Orleans yesterday, who is originally from Vermont. And she said that back when her and her kids were growing up, all you had up in Vermont were sports teams. Everybody's into sports, and there's no such thing as band and drumming and singing. But maybe there's choir, but not much more than that, right? And then she moved down to New Orleans, where Mardi Gras is what everybody lives for. And she said the amount of
art
talent
city.
that you see in high schools,
Art city.
right, with bands and drummers and being able to participate in parades, and is so vast. She had no idea how much talent could be tapped into, and we're missing that up north, because we don't have that kind of inbred realization of how key creativity is. And it brings me back to, we went to Kenya on our honeymoon with my husband, and it just seemed like it was so natural for people to celebrate things with dance and song and coming together, like that communal.
Dance and music is like
right. It's very intuitive. It's what the ancient people, what cave people did, right? And over the centuries, we sort of let ourselves forget that, which is a
it's
shame.
kind of been denigrated because, I mean, I think like sometimes like advanced culture, capitalist kind of culture ideas, like, well, it's more important to be a lawyer, be a doctor, be a scientist, right? They seem to have forgotten that spark, I mean, I'm African, out of my culture is heavily musical, like it's heavily into jazz and most American art forms were created by African Americans in terms of music, jazz, rock, blues, hip hop. They're all created from our culture. And if you check, the history, because it's inherently very connected to the culture that my grandpa could pick up like any and cousins, they just had natural ability. And it was encouraged. And in the church, the African American churches, they kind of encourage that, at least the singing and then even the playing. People learn how to play the organ they don't know how to read. And you can see it in New Orleans, you can see it in Tennessee, you can see it in the Delta, see it all over the place. And I think it's just when you embrace it, you don't overthink it. There's a lot of people, like I run into people like I can sight read, but I can play by ear. And a lot of times it's like more comfortable for me to play by ear. And so if I play with somebody that wants to know the charts, then I can't feel it because I can kind of feel it. And it's a difference, like when you can just feel it, it's kind of innate versus like learned. And there's something about that it's
Yeah, there was another kind of the other side of the spectrum today. There was another gentleman during the workshop who said, I can't handle so much freedom. I need very specific instructions on what I should do first and what are the constraints and what I do next, and obviously a programmer. But I think it's essentially the same thing, right? Is learning to trust your intuition and your gut as opposed to following a manual and going step by step. And I specifically make sure that what I teach is not what people have been used to in terms of those paint and sip workshops where you go from point A to point B and you connect them with a line and then you move on and everybody does the same thing and it all looks exactly the same. I do the complete opposite, which really throws people off. I let them choose what they want to create, what speaks to them. And that does make everyone uncomfortable because they have one vision in their head and they're seeing that they don't necessarily have the skills right away to reflect that on paper or canvas. And it really frustrates them. But what's really fascinating about the process, and I'm wondering if you see that in music too, because I've noticed that over the years with my own practice, but also watching people, is that whatever they're struggling with during a particular creative exercise, let's say, someone needs specific instructions, right? Or someone is really tied to the center and they can't see the big picture, right? Whatever they're struggling with during our painting exercise is a reflection of what they are struggling with in real life. And it's been a really interesting aha moment for me because a lot of times I catch myself in the studio just kind of being stuck in certain areas and unable to see the forest for the trees, and being overly concerned with one thing over the other. And it gives me a prompt to then say, okay, how is this reflective of everything else that's going on in life? And it gives me a very different perspective and a much bigger picture in terms of what can be changed and what can be looked into.
It's kind of interesting because if I had this kind of issue, well, not issue, but I was playing with like a classical musician, and you assume a classical musician is so talented, they could easily play like in a jazz or a jam band, but it's not the case. It's because they the sheet. So they're reading Chopin and Beethoven and Bach, and they're not really improvising, right? And they don't really. That's not they have a lot of constraints, and so when they get into a situation with like a free jazz or fusion, they're like, you think they technically could do it, and it could, but their head stops them. They're like looking for somebody to tell them what to do, and you actually have a time playing with them because they can't get the feel. And really like that form, like the blues is really feel. It's kind of based on the inherent capability of like a Lead Belly or a Hendrix or one of these great artists, and they do it by and do it off beat. And when somebody has to have that plan, it's hard to actually get them to get out of that. What I found, at least with like musicians who are used to reading the sheet, it's hard to get them to improvise or to play ear or to do kind of stream of consciousness. It's not natural for them. You have to kind of unlearn the book learning to get them to do it.
To get them to learn to be intuitive, right? I think that's the toughest
Yeah.
thing with the way that we've been taught and conditioned over the years. What I loved, there's a very famous performing artist. Well, she's a performance artist, so she's an artist that creates these really interesting situations for people. And one of them she created after going to Australia for a bit. She spent, I think, 3 or 4 months in Australia, and she was really watching Aboriginals communicate. And because it is so hot in that part of Australia, they don't want to be moving a lot. So they tend to sit in a circle
Mhm.
and almost close their eyes and communicate somehow on this energy level without words, simply
Energy. Wow.
through intuition. And
Hmm.
she repeated that experiment at MoMA in New York, where there was a line of visitors wanting to see this. It's her name is Marina Abramovich. Um, what she would do is she had a table and she would just sit, and people had the opportunity to sit across from her for 2 to 5 minutes. And it's very unnerving to us to communicate on a nonverbal level because we're not used to it. Whereas in other
Mm-hmm.
cultures, and cultures that are more primal in a way, and I think Steve Jobs was talking about that actually,
Mm-hmm.
that he learned a lot from Aboriginals about how to trust yourself, and trust other people's energy, and and learn to decipher what they're trying to say without saying anything.
I think that's hard to explain, but if you're with like a four-piece rock band or vibe, you really are connected to your fellow bandmates. There's tons of nonverbal communication going on. If you ever watch us on stage, we're always looking at each other. You know, that saxophone player, everybody's looking at each other because we're picking up these nonverbal. And if you ever did a lot of band, that you could see them looking at the drummer. They give him a look. They could see the communication. I've been watching films of Miles Davis with Colbert, be looking at him directly and be looking at, like when he worked with Herbie Hancock. They were looking at each other and they're doing cues just by nodding their head and their eyes, and it wasn't talking at all because they're actually playing their instrument. And you see it with musicians a lot. You can see the communication that happen. They actually they're talking. They actually understand what's going on. They know what the cues are. And I always find it's kind of hard to explain to people who aren't in that kind of situation, but I think it's similar to what you're saying.
Did you notice that things had changed in terms of touring that happened post COVID? Is there a different energy from the audience now that we've gone through this period of isolation?
Yeah,
Because
I mean,
I'm curious about that.
yeah, I mean the audience. Yeah, the audience expecting certain audience expect to hear things exactly the way they heard it on the right on the track, right? Like you put out a record, newer, younger audiences kind of want you to actually just replicate exactly what you. Where older audiences are more willing to hear a jam, they hear you actually reinterpret your work. The so there's a little there's just totally replicate like note for note exactly what they did, which is very, very boring. I don't find that enjoyable at all. I want to actually reinterpret my song as the same. And if you go back in the 80s and the 90s, 70s, even the 2000s, you could do that. Now, today, we have a lot of tools that actually keep us really locked in to what the original composition is. It's actually being run off of like boxes. They say you're in the box and you're kind of locked into what you originally wrote. And it's not that fun because you can't really deviate that far from what the original is. And to me, what's the point of being a musician if you can't express yourself.
If there's no creativity. Yeah, a friend of mine is a huge, huge fan of Eric Clapton, and she says that his recorded music is nothing in comparison
To what he does live.
to
Yeah.
what kind of you have to experience him live in order to truly understand what kind of a musician he is, and the potential and the level of his talent.
I think it's kind of sad to see younger artists locking themselves into computer-driven arpeggiation and actual where when I would go see the Allman Brothers at Great Woods and seeing Dickie Betts and seeing Greg Allman actually on his Hammond B3, and he's feeling it. You could see him feel it. You could see him doing it. I would go see it 3 nights in a row, and it was different. How they interpreted their own music, it was different. And it was actually why the would follow bands like the Grateful Dead, follow the Almonds. Why would they go see them night after night? Because they actually interpret their songs differently every time they do. In itself, as a fan, maybe some of the fans today kind of lost that because they like the repetition, and maybe because music is not the primary thing you do anymore. Like when you listen to music, you're doing something else. You're on your phone, you're on your iPad, you're doing something else, you're at work. You're not actually like when you were listening to vinyl, you was Pink Floyd. That was it. You're not doing other things at the same time. I think because we're multitasking, people want it to be familiar.
What I saw, our first concert that we took our teenager to this last summer was Imagine Dragons, and it was a completely full arena, just I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of people. But what I felt was that since COVID, people have this hunger to experience things together. Um, so there's a lot more
Mm.
of a desire to be in the space with someone for a live performance. I really could feel that communal energy, which is what live concerts are all about.
Yeah, I think people want to be together. Yeah, I think that's cool. This is what a technical musician, and I'm looking at it from a critical point. There are people who are still playing for him, but if you check, there's a lot of people who are in that kind of repetitive, in the really close to what they sound like. Now I know the audience is there; they want to feel it, and so you can have that audience participation, and they feel it. But kind of painting the quality of what's being done, versus like the communal nature of it. Yeah, it's still communal, but like when I went to see Woodstock, the Woodstock where Green Day was there, and it was like everybody was playing live. They weren't in the box. And so there's so many bands in the box today. It's kind of hard. If you don't know what that means, but if you ever seen a band that actually played their instruments, then you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we would go to the Montreal Jazz Festival every year, and it was so amazing to be able to experience so much diverse music, and these very unique ways of people tapping into their creative talents. Really, really cool. And yeah, from my point of
But
view
it's
as
in,
a visual artist, I can't create the same painting twice. It just doesn't happen, because every
mhm.
single time something else strikes you, different relationships between colors and lines, and um, what's fascinating to me is that there are a lot of artists, and I forget the term, it'll come back to me at some point, but there are a lot of artists who could see music, and Kandinsky
Oh
was
yeah,
was one of
no
them.
paintings.
Um, and they could paint music. So a lot of his compositions are actually titled as musical compositions. And the more and more and I always play music when I paint. I cannot paint in silence. So maybe that's partially me multitasking, but I think it also helps me tap into that kind of inner self, because there's a relationship with each thing that comes on the radio. Um, but I'm also starting to see that lines correlate to certain instruments, and colors are a reflection of other
Hmm.
instruments, and it's really really fascinating to really tap into that.
Well, I'm a sound designer, so what that means, I have synthesizers that can build sounds from waveforms. So my
Wow.
synthesizers can actually take a sine wave or a square wave and turn it into a custom tone. So I spend a lot of time building my tones before I even write a song.
Wow.
So I use them on my boards to create what we call sound paintings. And the kind of term came from if you think about George Martin when he was doing Sgt. Pepper's and Abbey Road and more band style Beatle albums. He said, "Well, how did you get to this place?" It's like like a palette. He actually said, "I could have recorded in Hamburg, just have as a live act, and we did. But then we decided, well, let's use the studio, like Mona, the canvas, because you can use the studio to layer." And what we do now today, based on what the Beatles did, is we layer sounds multiple that we can reproduce something sometimes you can't do live because it's the studio has become part of the actual process. And when you do that, it's very cinematic. You can evoke a lot of visual concepts, and he talked about it as like a sound painting. Hendrix also referred to it as a sound painting on Electric Ladyland. And people asked him what he
Hmm.
was doing, and you could hear birds, you could hear ocean. He said, I'm making sound paintings." He actually has a quote where he was talking about that. And I think that that's where I've always been in the music, where I feel it's very cinematic. It's very right because we actually do feel we see these scenes when we're writing our songs and we turn them into sound.
Yeah, it's almost like it's coming from a subconscious level, right? And actually, in terms of the research of the brain, our ability to see and hear came way before our ability to talk. So that part of the brain kind of, it's almost part of that reptilian part of the brain where,
Hmm.
our ability
Hmm.
to talk is something that develops when we're, 2 years old and older. But everything else, like the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of, what we're listening to and what we see, that came way, way before. And perhaps even when the babies are inside a mother's womb, they're already starting to hear and feel and see, right?
Yeah, they're
So
here.
it's
Yeah, they hear.
yeah, so it's those very
Yeah,
primal
it's
things that unfortunately over the years we tend to dismiss and pay a lot less attention to, unless that's our profession, right? And that's and we know that
yeah.
tapping
When
into
you're an art,
creativity is, yeah.
embrace it. Well, it is very primal because I mean, if you think about music, it's like the drum. The drum is like tribal, it's indigenous. Like so, when you start getting into drums, and what we as musicians have, like Pete Townsend talked about it. Like, there's this idea of a universal key or the universal kind of rhythm. When you're a musician and you tap into that universal key, like when he's at Woodstock, you could see the people are just like, wow, people into my I'm hitting frequencies, I'm hitting beats, and it's triggering behavior. And as a musician, you can see it in real time. You actually see what you as an art and people, and it makes them move, makes them react. You can get people to do things. You can get them to be happy, sad, riled up, every emotion. You can trigger frequencies. And once you realize that you can do that, then you can actually really understand your audience. And like the best musicians that really connect have figured out how to actually get to tap in like this universal feeling that you can get. And I think that's the creative process. Once you realize that it is that powerful, I think that's how you can kind of, use it across anything you want. You can use it when you talk, when you speak, the cues, the frequencies of your voice. Your voice is an instrument. Once you learn how it works, you can master it and you can affect.
Yeah. And similarly, from the world of visual art, colors affect us quite a bit in certain ways. And those artists who are able to tap into that, like Kandinsky, who was also seeing music, but at the same time wrote a whole book on the theory of color. And what does the color blue do to us? What does the color red do to us? What do we feel when we see orange and yellow? Once you can develop that language, you're right. It's incredibly potent and powerful. And I think the best thing that I had gotten when we were all isolated was a message from one of my collectors, and she said, the winds are blowing in so many directions right now, and everything is so uncertain. But when I look at this piece of art, it's so grounding and healing that I feel like everything's going to be okay. And that was such a powerful affirmation to me about just, if there's something that needs to be expressed, just do it. Because even if you're not
Yeah.
getting remuneration for it, because sooner or later that right person will see it. And even if it is just one person whose life changes by a fraction, it matters a lot.
Good. It seems like what art and it's like therapy for myself. But what I found is like if you're willing to, a lot of times like fear when I as an artist as I've gotten older, I'm 55, and the year old self was fearful of what I was doing, and you're always trying to get approval. As I've gotten older, when you put something down, there's always somebody that will understand it. And as you get older with the way social media, as musicians, like there's an audience for almost everything we do. And so you might think zone where you might be physically that won't work for wherever that is. But if you just put it out there in the ether, I'm very surprised that certain pieces actually get a lot of reaction to different parts of the planet. And that is very encouraging for us to understand that you shouldn't be fearful of what you can create. You should, actually embrace it. And once that, I think it opens up the walls. I think it starts to like give you that spark of creativity can really help you as a therapeutic measure. And I've actually done it in my life and worked with other artists and where we're in that kind of headspace and we feel it does help us.
Yeah, it's funny that you said Spark, because this is how and that's the acronym that I had created for my method of getting people into flow. And it starts out with being present, right? So letter S is for staying present, and truly in space, as you just said. Letter and P is for paying attention, kind of paying attention to everything around you, all the different sounds and smells and wind, and how it is that your body is reacting and truly feeling. Letter A is allowing yourself to play, which a lot of us have forgotten how to do. Artists are really good at that, but most people don't let their inner child out uh, at all. Um, Letter R is releasing the end result, which I think is so exceptionally hard for people because we've been trained to be so focused on goals and setting timelines and going through that to-do list, right? That simply dissolving in the process and enjoying the journey is so, so hard. And finally, letter K is being kind to ourselves, because once everything is done and over, a lot of us start judging, how am I in comparison to my neighbor? How am I doing? Why even begin this in the first place? And it is to allow yourself to just be and try and be willing to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's
But
very
it's tough
hard.
for so
Because the
many
thing
people.
is, I try to tell people as a creative musician, if you think about the number of songs that we create as a writer, if you're a singer songwriter, I would venture to say that probably almost 90% of your work probably never worked, right? That it's very rare that the work that you create actually connects, but that doesn't mean that it failed. Like as an artist, to progress, and you have to write so many songs. If you think about an album, it might have 10 songs, and one of them is the single one, if you're lucky, maybe you're two, but most of them people don't know or people don't listen to. Some of the work is not connecting at the level of a single. And and so you would you get because they're not all connected. No, you have to keep on progressing. And so you have to accept that failure. I don't think it's a failure. I think you have to learn and that you're gonna get better. You're gonna become the next version of yourself as you grow as a musician. You're always the next song is a kind of a progression in your capability. Usually, you keep on going to a certain level, and then maybe eventually you drop off, but you have this kind of ascending line at the beginning of your career, and then maybe you stabilize, and maybe then you drop off. But it's a process.
And I think a lot of times we as artists are so tough on ourselves because we seek that approval. And it's a very hard line between doing something because this is truly who you are and what you want to express versus people pleasing and getting that hit of recognition and affirmation and songs that you had created were some of your best work, but because people don't recognize it, it doesn't mean that it was all for nothing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I try to tell people about you think about William Blake, the great Victorian poet. Nobody knew him in his time. And art considered him one of the great Victorian poets. But during his time, nobody knew who he was at all. But he actually etched all his work in acid on metal plates because he believed that it should be permanent. So he had this idea, wasn't a marketer, so nobody knew who he was. But he made them all those the songs of innocence and experience are actually on metal plates with all this intricate
Wow.
art tied to them. And some people don't realize that that's the way those poems are. They just know of the innocence and experience. They don't realize that the source material art on metal plates with all this ornate art tied to
I
the
had no
poem.
idea.
So they're actually
Wow.
pieces of art with poetry. If you ever go to a library and look for the songs of innocence, the actual metal plates that actually have the artwork that go, then you're like, wow, this guy was brilliant, but he wasn't time. So it shows you that you shouldn't not put something out because you never know if some other age might find it. So the way I look at it is like that was always a very inspirational story when I learned it and when I was in college at Bowdoin College. I went to Bowdoin, and I was in a class that they taught us that, and wow, and they actually showed us the original plates, and I'm like, wow, that was very inspirational to me. That is, don't be scared to put your stuff out, and don't be scared to put it somewhere and store it and put it in a good. If you take the away, you should believe in it enough to think that other people should see it.
Yeah, and I think that's what a lot of creatives are struggling with is having that belief and trust in themselves, um, especially when times are tough and it feels like nobody's listening and nobody's watching. Um, if I had a message for my 20-year-old self who freaked out after graduating and decided, no, I'm not going to live the life of a starving artist, if I had the trust and confidence in my talent, I would have gotten to where I am so much faster. And I think a lot of artists who graduate from liberal arts colleges, they never end up as artists because there's just not enough self-worth there.
Support. Yeah, well, you have to self-support, which is like the big key. Because what I found is like when I started to believe in myself, because I had a kind of catastrophic thing. I had cancer at age 27 and I beat it. Then I said, you know what? I'm going to do what I want to do in my dreams. I'm going to do my art career I did it parallel to my business career and it wouldn't stop. And to the point where now, I'm doing this podcast, but that's just a piece of what I do. But I just decided to believe in it. And then people come because you put it out there. And I really am a big believer. Like if you have the courage to put your work out, people will come to it. And you get critics, you'll get people that don't like it, but if you'd be surprised. I've been very surprised by the reception of some of my pieces that I didn't think anybody would care about, and I just had the courage to put it out. Where I know a lot of artists, they got stockpiles of tapes, and then I listen to it and I say, this stuff is brilliant, and they won't put it out. And I'm like imploring them, you should put it out. This stuff is great, and they just don't believe it. Like if you don't believe it, I can't get you to do it.
I think there's a huge fear of rejection that's at play, right? Because what if you do put it out there and because it is your baby, right? It is your heart and soul, and you get those critics who are exceptionally negative, then it's very, very tough to not take that personally and to keep on going and to keep on believing. So a lot of the folks who I've come across who are just brilliant artists, that is really the true fear. Because as humans, right, we want that connection. We want people to connect to what we're doing. But if they're not, then you kind of feel like a lone wolf and like you're not quite understanding your tribe, right?
Yeah, it's almost like, if you deal with a therapist, you go to an analyst, and you get to the point where you have like this crucible through. And what we found is like artists who have kind of had a crucible moment where something happened, then they got the confidence. They start to have the self-love and the self-respect for themselves. And then other artists were like, well, I'm better than them, but you won't put anything out. You might be, but you're not confident enough, so you actually are stuck. You put a glass ceiling, and this other guy that you don't think is as good as you is willing to put it out, and they actually are eclipsing you because it's you. You're not. You don't have the confidence. And sometimes it's this: if somebody will take that step, they get the attention. And if you happen to put yourself out there, well, no one's gonna even know you're there.
Yeah, it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, right? You won't be understood unless you're willing to speak, right? But in order to speak, you have to have the confidence that there will be at least someone that will understand it. And you know what I have just found, and I know that we're running close to the end here, that some of the mistakes that I've made personally is really seeking that recognition and validation and going with my ego as opposed to trusting my intuition. And I think that is a very interesting fine line, and knowing at which point you should be able to set up boundaries against the ego, right? And just create from the heart.
Yeah, it's just the people who are like the naysayers or the people who are the haters. They say, it's easy to be a hater if you're not. Most of them aren't creative. I always looked at it once I got confident. You say they're not even creating anything, and then they're going to judge what I even. So the way I look at it is, okay, I'm not going to worry about it. Like you got to let it kind of go roll off you, but that's hard because a lot of people like it is your baby. It is something personal, and it's when you can get to like at the level in yourself that you can stand that criticism, right? That you can deal with the fact that not everybody's gonna love it. And that's a hard place to be, and you never know who is ready for that because it's a personal position. Like it's hard you can't train people. People have to come to that decision on their own, in my opinion. They can be kind of led, but unless they got to choose to pull the trigger or not. If they're going to do that.
Yeah. And especially, I think it's especially tough when you're dealing with gatekeepers, and it is really up to them to decide whether you're going to make it to the next level or not. But at the end of the day, you also want to think back to the fact that they're just people, right? And it's their subjective opinion. And if they reject you, and I'm sure you've got tons and tons of rejection in your life, so you would know,
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that what you're creating is bad. It just means that it's either that the pool of applicants was so large that somehow you didn't make the cut, right? Or the theme was totally different, or simply that the subjective opinion of the gatekeeper does not jive with your opinion on life, and that's fine. It's totally fine. It just it's a numbers game, right?
Well, I think today what's good is because we have, at least in the music world, we've been able to get rid of a lot of the gates because you can go off and do something on YouTube Short. You could go create a, tick clip. You can go and put something on SoundCloud and it suddenly get hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people to jump on it. And the gatekeepers didn't have anything to do with it. And so, and I don't know if in the visual arts, if there are places to do much of it is for musicians now. We have a lot of places we can put our music where the gatekeepers don't stop us, where we can actually, do a lot of self promotion. But I know you have your website, and I was going to kind of speak to that. Like, so if people go to the website, you see www.plein dash
That's the
academy.com. What will people get there?
This is my teaching studio website, and that's where people go to sign up for classes, to sign up for workshops, for corporate retreats. My umbrella website, which is probably easier to spell, I should have given you that one, is just my name, dianastelin.com. And that has, just like you, I wear many hats. And that umbrella website has everything. It has my art. It has a way to also book classes and workshops, but also public speaking opportunities and podcast interviews. And I also launched a fashion line at the beginning of COVID. Winning quite a bit of attention from international press, because it's a lot of garments that stem from my art, and it's a sustainable line. So all of that is under my umbrella website, which is dianastelin.com. Thank you for putting that on there.
Yeah, we always want to make sure, and that will actually be when we put it into the publish the website, well, the podcast, when it goes to our blogger page and a bunch of other places, the links will be clickable. So when we'll go and revise that to make sure that's in there. But thank you again for being on the podcast, because it's always cool to talk to creative people. I mean, that's where we started the podcast. We started with artists, and I do feel that what you're saying how you're using art therapy is a really positive thing, because I think people need to get passionate about the arts. And then maybe for every person that takes your class, then they go back to their school committee and say, maybe you shouldn't take art off the curriculum, so we can get the next generation of artists out there interested, whether they want to be a painter or a photographer or any kind of art or musician. It's like I believe that the arts needs
And
to
at the
be
adult,
supported.
yeah, or even at the adult stage, I'm really excited because I'm traveling out to Savannah next week, to be on a panel for the Society of Human Resource Managers, and it's a panel on
Mhm.
mental health. And I think that is excellent news because HR managers are starting to see what kind of a role art can play in terms of appeasing some of the retention issues that they've been having, and getting people to be happy at work. So things are hopefully changing for the better.
Yeah, I've had some talks about like the idea in corporate world want creatives, but then they try to put you in the bell curve, and creatives tend to not be inside that bell curve. They tend to be on the outside of the bell curve. And then, like, if you want somebody who has that talent, putting them into a SAT type of world isn't where their head's at. And so if you want that kind of artistic capability, you have to learn how to measure it or understand it. Or maybe you can't measure it, but you have to understand how to appreciate it or understand it, and then be able to not drive away those type of folks with the rigidity of your structure. Because
Yeah.
creative people tend to not want to fit into that too rigid a structure. If you're too rigid and don't have that kind of gray areas open, and you don't recognize them, then I think that's a big lesson to a lot of corporate people, that if they can understand the creative mind, then they could probably retain more creative minds.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just having people be a lot more balanced, right, and happy at work. Um,
Yeah.
because those of us who are able to tap into our creativity, I think, are just happier people.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you for being on the show tonight.
Thank you. Thanks
We
for
will
having
be
me.
published everywhere tomorrow. Thank you again.
Excellent.
Have a good night.
Excellent. Yes, you too. Thank you.